This is Scott Betker with a podcast that reviews Betker's Healthcare podcast that reviews President Biden's first 100 days in office, what's happened so far, what's going on, where the priorities been, what priorities have not been attacked yet, and so forth. We'll work through this in about 15 to 20 points. The first thing I'll talk about is the top five priorities of the Biden administration, at least from campaigns and so forth, seem to be as follows: COVID-19 vaccines, testing, and so forth. Second, shoring up Medicaid and the ACA. Third, expanding Medicare, and this is particularly the option of expanding Medicare to 60 from 65. Fourth, allowing CMS to do drug negotiations on behalf of Medicare so as to give more bargaining power with pharmaceutical companies. And fifth, adding a public option. As we look at all this, our second point is, remember that we're still at 30 million uninsured in the country, about that number. The third point I'll note is that none of these things talk about the great need for more doctors and nurses and providers in our country. Residency spots, more people going to medical school, going to nursing school, and improving the supply of doctors and nurses and other kinds of clinicians. The fourth thing that I'll note is that the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan, largely left out health care. And this is the progressive left is a little upset by this, but it doesn't talk about the expanding of Medicare, Medicare drug negotiations, or adding the public option. These were left out of these two big plans so far. For example, and as we noted, the fifth point, policies regarding lowering the Medicare age or drug negotiations were not put into these plans. And these are the plans that were announced at his State of the Union or big speech to Congress and the nation. Sixth, so far this year, have largely focused on vaccines and testing and moving that forward. Thus far, 230 million doses or so have been put into arms as of just a few days ago. So huge progress there. Recently, mask guidance was updated from the CDC. This does get some politicking from the right and the left. The right uses as an indication that masks might not have been that needed to begin with. The left says essentially this is a result of Biden doubling down on the vaccines, using the Defense Protection Act, and really moving things forward to Defense Production Act, and really things moving forward to allow us to be at the spot. There's some talk that some of the nurses unions were upset by the reducing the mask requirements, as they bear the brunt of a lot of the problems when people have COVID-19. Recently, also, President Biden did get to a spot where we're shipping 20 million doses to overseas. Obviously, a piece of sand in the ocean, but at least helpful. Still dealing with issues of vaccine hesitancy, as 40-50% of Americans have been vaccinated, and we're starting to lower the vaccine age. Still dealing one-to-one on a grassroots basis with people that are working on, that have vaccine hesitancy, don't want to take vaccines. Another issue on vaccines, we're all expecting there will be boosters this fall. We're hoping that it's rolled out in a clearer and easier way than the original rollout of vaccines this first 4 or so months. There was, in the American Rescue Plan, the original plan that was the $1.9 trillion stimulus plan, there was $8.9 million put into that for additional testing and for vaccine distribution and for providers. So $8.5 billion was in the American Rescue Plan. Second point we'll talk about is the American Families legislation does make the subsidies for the ACA permanent, and they go up to people with incomes of $51,000 or so. It also makes part of the tax credits for buying health insurance on the exchanges permanent as well. These subsidies, the CBO says, help about 1.3 million people over a course of 2 years. That still would leave you 29 million people without insurance in our country. The Congressional Budget Office says that the subsidies are a much more expensive way of providing people with the uninsured health care than adding them to Medicare or Medicaid. And as most people remember, most people that have been added to the insured rolls through the ACA came through Medicaid expansion. At least 80+% came through Medicaid expansion. President Biden also did add in, as a 10th point, special enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act. That started February 15th, goes to August 15th. About 4 million people would be eligible under the rules to sign up for that. So far, 1 million or so have signed up. So he added another 1 million people that have bought insurance through the exchanges through his extended enrollment option. Thus far, as we noted before, no action yet. A public option, which is very popular amongst Americans of both parties, reducing the Medicare eligible age to 60, which is probably also very popular amongst all Americans, or pharma negotiations. And of course, this is the art of the doable, or the art of the real, is that there's a lot of issues with payers, pharma, and providers as you start to really go after these priorities. Providers like the additional coverage, but don't like the fact of more people that are covered at lower rates. Pharma obviously doesn't love negotiating with Medicare, where Medicare or CMS has lots of power, and payers don't like anything that takes away business and the need of payers. So you've got lots of conflict, lots of these are very expensive. I think, as we probably said in last year's talk, Biden will be able to spend most of the first year really focused on COVID and attack these in the second year if he can. They're obviously very popular campaign issues, and Democrats ran a lot of those on healthcare issues in 2020. So far, as we've talked about, 12 most ACA progress has been regarding expanding Medicaid. President Biden in his 13 did issue an executive order that says immigrants, as a requirement for immigration, won't be required to prove that they have health care insurance. This was a rule put in place by the Trump administration. That executive order was recently rescinded. 14th point, which is similar to what we just talked about on the public option and expanding the Medicare enrollment and so forth, is Vox recently wrote an article, Why Democrats' Ambitions for Healthcare Are Shrinking Rapidly. And I think the real take-home point of it is it's expensive and there's lots of fights to be had to go after some of the big ambitions. So payers, pharma, providers, there's a lot of constituents that are all over the board on some of these Democratic ambitions for healthcare. And I think President Biden could succeed by really focusing this year on COVID-19, vaccinations, and so forth. The estimated cost of the public option is about $800 billion. That's over, I think, a 10-year period, but a significant cost. The ACA, in contrast, was paid for by spending cuts to providers and new taxes. Providers are less excited about new spending cuts, and new taxes is, of course, always its own issue. President Biden did invoke the Defense Production Act to help with vaccines, viewed as probably very helpful, significantly incrementally helpful in getting more Americans vaccinated. The American Jobs Plan, which is, again, one of these pieces of legislation that's to come, that they're working on, does include $18 billion for veterans clinics and hospitals, and a huge amount for home health and long-term care, not a lot for core providers and clinics, and again, not a lot to address this core issue we have of a shortage of physicians and nurses in our country. As we noted before, the American Rescue Plan, the ARP, had a $1.9 trillion stimulus, had $8.5 billion for providers and for vaccine distributions, and incentives for states to expand Medicaid. And again, if you look at Biden's two of his big priorities, shoring up the ACA and helping to strengthen Medicaid, making progress there, and also clearly making progress on vaccines and COVID-19. A different perspective on the Vox perspective, Vox has said why Dems' ambitions for healthcare are shrinking rapidly. The Planned Parenthood, in contrast, has said recently in an article, here are 6 ways that Biden has protected our health and rights in his first 100 days. So a lot of positive from that organization on what Biden has done. And they point to rejoining the World Health Organization, which largely popular on the right and left, and a number of other actions that they are very much in favor of in terms of reproductive health and so forth. So, and also they announced they thought that many of his picks were champions of reproductive health. So at the end of the day, very positive reviews from Planned Parenthood, less positive reviews from Vox. But that's where we sort of stand today. 5 big priorities, progress made on 2 of those 5. The 3 others, expanding Medicare drug negotiations, adding a public option, remains to be seen at what point there will be progress made on those. And obviously, from my perspective, what will be done to help improve the supply of doctors and clinicians in our country, which seems to be a big long-term problem. In any event, thank you for listening to this podcast on Biden's first 100 days. Thank you very much.